On 1 January 1956, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan became the independent Republic of the Sudan. Before 1955, however, the government under Ismail al-Azhari had temporarily halted Sudan's progress towards self-determination, hoping to promote unity with Egypt. Despite his pro-Egyptian National Unionist Party winning a majority in the 1953 parliamentary elections, however, Azhari realized that popular opinion had shifted against such a union. Azhari, who had been the major spokesman for the unity of the Nile Valley, therefore reversed the NUP's stand and supported Sudanese independence. On December 19, 1955, the Sudanese parliament, under Azhari's leadership, unanimously adopted a declaration of independence that became effective on January 1, 1956. Azhari called for the withdrawal of foreign troops and requested the condominium powers to sponsor a plebiscite in advance. Politics of independence. Sudan achieved independence without the rival political parties having agreed on the form and content of a permanent constitution. Instead, the Constituent Assembly adopted a document known as the Transitional Constitution, which replaced the Governor-General as head of state with a five-member Supreme Commission that was elected by a parliament composed of an indirectly elected Senate and a popularly elected House of Representatives. The Transitional Constitution also allocated executive power to the Prime Minister, who was nominated by the House of Representatives and confirmed in office by the Supreme Commission. Although it achieved independence without conflict, Sudan inherited many problems from the condominium. Chief among these was the status of the civil service. The government placed Sudanese in the administration and provided compensation and pensions for British officers of the Sudan Political Service who left the country. It retained those who could not be replaced, mostly technicians and teachers. Khartoum achieved this transformation quickly and with a minimum of turbulence. Although Southerners resented the replacement of British administrators in the south with Northern Sudanese, to advance their interests, many Southern leaders concentrated their efforts in Khartoum, where they hoped to win constitutional concessions. Although determined to resist what they perceived to be Arab imperialism, they were opposed to violence. Most Southern representatives supported provincial autonomy and warned that failure to win legal concessions would drive the South to rebellion. The parliamentary regime introduced plans to expand the country's education, economic, and transportation sectors. To achieve these goals, Khartoum needed foreign economic and technical assistance, to which the United States made an early commitment. Conversations between the two governments had begun in mid-1957, and the Parliament ratified a United States aid agreement in July 1958. Washington hoped this agreement would reduce Sudan's excessive reliance on a one-crop economy and would facilitate the development of the country's transportation and communications infrastructure. The Prime Minister formed a coalition government in February 1956, but he alienated the Katmia by supporting increasingly secular government policies. In June, some Katmia members who had defected from the NUP established the People's Democratic Party under Mergani's leadership. The UMA and the PDP combined in parliament to bring down the Azhari government. With support from the two parties and backing from the Ansar and the Katmia, Abdullah Khalil put together a coalition government. Major issues confronting Khalil's coalition government included winning agreement on a permanent constitution, stabilizing the South, encouraging economic development, and improving relations with Egypt. Strains within the UMA-PDP coalition hampered the government's ability to make progress on these matters. The UMA, for example, wanted the proposed constitution to institute a presidential form of government on the assumption that Abd al-Rahman al-Mahdi would be elected the first president. Consensus was lacking about the country's economic future. A poor cotton harvest followed the 1957 bumper cotton crop, which Sudan had been unable to sell at a good price in a glutted market. This downturn depleted Sudan's reserves and caused unrest over government-imposed economic restrictions. To overcome these problems and finance future development projects, the UMA called for greater reliance on foreign aid. The PDP, however, objected to this strategy because it promoted unacceptable foreign influence in Sudan. The PDP's philosophy reflected the Arab nationalism espoused by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had replaced Egyptian leader Naguib in 1954. Despite these policy differences, the UMA-PDP coalition lasted for the remaining year of the parliament's tenure. Moreover, after the parliament adjourned, the two parties promised to maintain a common front for the 1958 elections. The electorate gave a plurality in both houses to the UMA and an overall majority to the UMA-PDP coalition. The NUP, however, won nearly 1/4 of the seats, largely from urban centers and from Gezira scheme agricultural workers. In the south, the vote represented a rejection of the men who had cooperated with the government. Voters defeated all three southerners in the pre-election cabinet, and a victory for advocates of autonomy within a federal system. Resentment against the government's taking over mission schools and against the measures used in suppressing the 1955 mutiny contributed to the election of several candidates who had been implicated in the rebellion. After the new parliament convened, Kalal again formed an UMA-PDP coalition government. Unfortunately, factionalism, corruption, and vote fraud dominated parliamentary deliberations at a time when the country needed decisive action with regard to the proposed constitution and the future of the South. As a result, the UMA-PDP coalition failed to exercise effective leadership. Another issue that divided the parliament concerned Sudanese-United States relations. In March 1958, Kalal signed a technical assistance agreement with the United States. When he presented the pact to Parliament for ratification, he discovered that the NUP wanted to use the issue to defeat the UMA-PDP coalition and that many PDP delegates opposed the agreement. Nevertheless, the UMA, with the support of some PDP and Southern delegates, managed to obtain approval of the agreement. Factionalism and bribery in Parliament, coupled with the government's inability to resolve Sudan's many social, political, and economic problems, increased popular disillusion with democratic government. Specific complaints included Khartoum's decision to sell cotton at a price above world market prices. This policy resulted in low sales of cotton, the commodity from which Sudan derived most of its income. Restrictions on imports imposed to take pressure off depleted foreign exchange reserves caused consternation among town dwellers who had become accustomed to buying foreign goods. Moreover, rural northerners also suffered from an embargo that Egypt placed on imports of cattle, camels, and dates from Sudan. Growing popular discontent caused many anti-government demonstrations in Khartoum. Egypt also criticized Kalal and suggested that it might support a coup against his government. Meanwhile, reports circulated in Khartoum that the UMA and the NUP were near agreement on a new coalition that would exclude the PDP and Kalal. On November 17, 1958, the day Parliament was to convene, a military coup occurred. Kalal, himself a retired army general, planned a preemptive coup in conjunction with leading UMA members and the army's two senior generals, Ibrahim Aboud and Ahmed Abd al-Wahhab, who became leaders of the military regime. Aboud immediately pledged to resolve all disputes with Egypt, including the long-standing problem of the status of the Nile River. Aboud abandoned the previous government's unrealistic policies regarding regarding the sale of cotton. He also appointed a constitutional commission, headed by the Chief Justice, to draft a permanent constitution. Abad maintained, however, that political parties only served as vehicles for personal ambitions and that they would not be re-established when civilian rule was restored. Abad military government. The coup removed political decision-making from the control of the civilian politicians. Abad created the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to rule Sudan. This body contained officers affiliated with the Ansar and the Katmiyya. Abad belonged to the Katmiyya, whereas Abd al-Wahhab was a member of the Ansar. Until Abd al-Wahhab's removal in March 1959, the Ansar were the stronger of the two groups in the government. The regime benefited during its first year in office from successful marketing of the cotton crop. Abad also profited from the settlement of the Nile waters dispute with Egypt and the improvement of relations between the two countries. Under the military regime, the influence of the Ansar and the Katmiyya lessened. The strongest religious leader, Abd ar-Rahman al-Mahdi, died in early 1959. His son and successor, the elder Sadiq al-Mahdi, failed to enjoy the respect accorded his father. When Sadiq died 2 years later, Ansar religious and political leadership divided between his brother Imam al-Hadi al-Mahdi and his son, the younger Sadiq al-Mahdi. Despite the Abad regime's early successes, opposition elements remained powerful. In 1959, dissident military officers made 3 attempts to displace the Abad government and to establish a popular government. Quote, although the courts sentenced the leaders of these attempted coups to life imprisonment, discontent in the military continued to hamper the government's performance. In particular, the Sudanese Communist Party, which supported the attempted coups, gained a reputation as an effective anti-government organization. To compound its problems, the Abad regime lacked dynamism and the ability to stabilize the country. Its failure to place capable civilian advisors in positions of authority, to launch a credible economic and social development program, and to gain the army's support created an atmosphere that encouraged political turbulence. Abad's southern policy proved to be his undoing. The government suppressed expressions of religious and cultural differences and bolstered attempts to Arabize society. In February 1964, for example, Abad ordered the mass expulsion of foreign missionaries from the south. He then closed parliament to cut off outlets for southern complaints. Southern leaders had renewed in 1963 the armed struggle against the Sudanese government that had continued sporadically since 1955. The rebellion was spearheaded from 1963 by guerrilla forces known as the Anyanya. Return to civilian rule. Recognizing its inability to quell growing southern discontent, the Abad regime asked the civilian sector to submit proposals for a solution to the southern problem. However, criticism of government policy quickly went beyond the southern issue and included Abad's handling of other problems, such as the economy and education. Government attempts to silence these protests, which were centered in the University of Khartoum, brought a reaction not only from teachers and students but also from Khartoum's civil servants and trade unionists. The so-called October Revolution of 1964 centered around a general strike that spread throughout the country. Strike leaders identified themselves as the National Front for Professionals. Along with some former politicians, they formed the leftist United National Front, which made contact with dissident army officers. After several days of rioting that resulted in many deaths, Abad dissolved the government and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. UNF leaders and army commanders who planned the transition from military to civilian rule selected a non-political senior civil servant, Sir Al-Khatim al-Khalifa, as prime minister to head a transitional government. The new civilian regime, which operated under under the 1956 Transitional Constitution, tried to end political factionalism by establishing a coalition government. There was continued popular hostility to the reappearance of political parties, however, because of the divisiveness during the Abad regime. Although the new government allowed all parties, including the SCP, to operate, only 5 of 15 posts in Khattam's cabinet went to party politicians. The Prime Minister gave 2 positions to non-party Southerners and the remaining 8 members of the National Front for Professionals, which included several communists. Eventually 2 political parties emerged to represent the South. The Sudan African National Union, founded in 1963 and led by William Deng and Satrino Lahuri, a Roman Catholic priest, operated among refugee groups and guerrilla forces. The Southern Front, a mass organization led by Stanislaus Payasama that had worked underground during the Abad regime, functioned openly within the southern provinces. After the collapse of government-sponsored peace conferences in 1965, Deng's wing of SANUs, known locally as SANU William, and the Southern Front coalesced to take part in the parliamentary elections. SANU remained active in parliament for the next 4 years as a voice for southern regional autonomy within a unified state. Exiled SANU leaders balked at Deng's moderate approach and formed the Azania Liberation Front based in Kampala, Uganda. Anyanya leaders remained aloof from political movements. The guerrillas were fragmented by ethnic and religious differences. Additionally, conflicts surfaced within Anyanya between older leaders who had been in the bush since 1955, and younger, better-educated men like Joseph Lagu, a former Sudanese army captain, who eventually became a strong guerrilla leader, largely because of his ability to get arms from Israel. The government scheduled national elections for March 1965 and announced that the new parliament's task would be to prepare a new constitution. The deteriorating southern security situation prevented elections from being conducted in that region, however, and the political parties split on the question of whether elections should be held in the north as scheduled or postponed until the whole country could vote. The PDP and SCP, both fearful of losing votes, wanted to postpone the elections, as did southern elements loyal to Khartoum. Their opposition forced the government to resign. The president of the reinstated Supreme Commission, who had replaced Abad as chief of state, directed that the elections be held wherever possible. The PDP rejected this decision and boycotted the elections. The 1965 election results were inconclusive. Apart from a low voter turnout, there was a confusing overabundance of candidates on the ballots. As a result, few of those elected won a majority of the votes cast. The UMA captured 75 out of 158 parliamentary seats, while its NUP ally took 52 of the remainder. The two parties formed a coalition cabinet in June headed by UMA leader Mohammed Ahmad Majub, whereas Azhari, the NUP leader, became the Supreme Commission's permanent president and chief of state. The Majub government had two goals: progress towards solving the southern problem and the removal of communists from positions of power. The army launched a major offensive to crush the rebellion and in the process augmented its reputation for brutality among the Southerners. Many Southerners reported government atrocities against civilians, especially at Juba and War. Sudanese army troops also burned churches and huts, closed schools, and destroyed crops and cattle. To achieve his second objective, Majub succeeded in having Parliament approve a decree that abolished the SCP and deprived the 11 communists of the seats. In October 1965, the UMA-NUP coalition collapsed because of a disagreement over whether Majub, as Prime Minister, or Azhari, as President, should conduct Sudan's foreign relations. Majub continued stayed in office for another 8 months but resigned in July 1966 after a parliamentary vote of censure, which resulted in a split in the Ummah. The traditional wing led by Majub, under the Imam al-Hadi al-Majub's spiritual leadership, opposed the party's majority. The latter group professed loyalty to the Imam's nephew, the younger Sadiq al-Mahdi, who was the Ummah's official leader and who rejected religious sectarianism. Sadiq became prime minister with backing from his own Ummah wing and from NUP allies. The Sadiq al-Mahdi government, supported by a sizable parliamentary majority, sought to reduce regional disparities by organizing economic development. Sadiq al-Mahdi also planned to use his personal rapport with southern leaders to engineer a peace agreement with the insurgents. He proposed to replace the Supreme Commission with a president and a southern vice president and called for the approval of autonomy for the southern provinces. The educated elite and segments of the army opposed Sadiq al-Mahdi because of his gradualist approach to Sudan's political, economic, and social problems. Leftist student organizations and the trade unions demanded the creation of a socialist state. Although these elements lacked widespread popular support, they represented an influential portion of educated public opinion. The resentment of Sadiq increased when he refused to honor a Supreme Court ruling that overturned legislation banning the SCP and ousting communists elected to parliamentary seats. In December 1966, a coup attempt by communists and a small army unit against the government failed. The government subsequently arrested many communists and army personnel. In March 1967, the government held elections in 36 constituencies in pacified southern areas. The Sadiq al-Mahdi wing of the Ummah won 15 seats, the Federalists SANU 10, and the NUP 5. Despite this apparent boost in his support, however, Sadiq's position in parliament had become tenuous because of concessions he promised to the south in order to bring an end to the civil war. The Ummah traditionalist wing opposed Sadiq al-Mahdi because of his support for constitutional guarantees of religious freedom and his refusal to declare Sudan an Islamic state. When the traditionalists and the NUP withdrew the support, his government fell. In May 1967, Majub became prime minister and head of a coalition government whose cabinet included members of his wing of the Ummah, of the NUP, and of the PDP. In December 1967, the PDP and the NUP formed the Democratic Unionist Party under al-Azhari's leadership. By early 1968, widening divisions in the Ummah threatened the survival of the Majub government. Sadiq al-Mahdi's wing held a majority in parliament and could thwart any government action. Majub therefore dissolved parliament. However, Sadiq refused to recognize the legitimacy of the prime minister's action. As a result, two governments functioned in Khartoum, one meeting in the parliament building and the other on its lawn, both of which claimed to represent the legislature's will. The army commander requested clarification from the Supreme Court regarding which of them had authority to issue orders. The court backed Majub's dissolution. The government scheduled new elections for April. Although the DUP won 101 of 218 seats, no single party controlled a parliamentary majority. 36 seats went to the Ummah traditionalists, 30 to the Sadiq wing, and 25 to the two southern parties, SANU and the Southern Front. The SCP Secretary-General Abd al-Khalik Majub also won a seat. In a major setback, Sadiq lost his own seat to a traditionalist rival. Because it lacked a majority, the DUP concluded an alliance with Ummah traditionalists who received the prime ministership for the leader, Muhammad Ahmad Majub, and 4 other cabinet posts. The coalition's program included plans for government reorganization, closer ties with the Arab world, and renewed economic development efforts, particularly in the southern provinces. The Muhammad Ahmad Majub government also accepted military, technical, and economic aid from the Soviet Union. Sadiq al-Mahdi's wing of the Ummah formed the small parliamentary opposition, when it refused to participate in efforts to complete the draft constitution, already 10 years overdue. The government retaliated by closing the opposition's newspaper and clamping down on pro-Sadiq demonstrations in Khartoum. By late 1968, the two Ummah wings agreed to support the anti-chief Imam al-Hadi al-Mahdi in the 1969 presidential election. At the same time, the DUP announced that Azhari also would seek the presidency. The communists and other leftists aligned themselves behind the presidential candidacy of former Chief Justice Babakar Awadallah, whom they viewed as an ally because he had ruled against the government when it attempted to outlaw the SCP. Bibliography: Muhammad Hassan Fadlallah, Short History of Sudan, a Universe, 30th of April 2004, ISBN 0-595-314252. Muhammad Hassan Fadlallah, The Problem of Darfur, a Universe, Inc. ISBN 978-0-595-36502-9.